Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Constitution Center and happy Constitution Day. Ken is right. We're about to hear from Ken, but first, it's my pleasure to introduce my collaborator and friend, the head of WHYY, which is co-sponsoring this great event today, Bill Marazzo.
Jeff, thank you. You want to hold this?
Sure.
Thanks. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the National Constitution Center and WHYY, thanks for taking the time to be with us this afternoon. This new series from Ken and Lynn Novick is yet another epic, perhaps an overused word, but 10 years in the making. The Vietnam War is certainly an opportunity for all of us across the country to take a time out and think about a conflict that some of us, at least, who served in that war thought we understood why we were there. But if you tuned in to watch the first episode last night, Deja Vu, there's a lot of richness and nuances that brought us as a country into that war, starting all the way back, I guess, with World War I, right? So it all seemed to make much more sense last night as a result of the first episode. So on behalf of WHYY, Jeff, I thank you for your many courtesies and the hospitality today. I do want to thank our local sponsor for the series, the Hill at Whitemarsh. I do want to thank all of you veterans who have been active in helping WHYY plan on air and off air a whole suite of activities over the next couple of weeks to help jumpstart an important discussion amongst yourselves about this conflict. And finally, for those of you who have access to WHYY's passport service as members, please know that through the grace of Lynn and Ken, you can binge watch this entire series starting last night, all 18 hours, right? So we'll send pizza and popcorn out to you. But may I thank and commend the two of you for your remarkable service to our country and for the opportunity to be able to be the one broadcast outlet that distributes all of your work. My thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bill. Ladies and gentlemen, we are so honored that the day after the premiere of Ken Burn and Lynn Novick's new series on Vietnam, they've come to the Constitution Center to share it with you. Ken and Lynn are primarily constitutional educators. Ken told me before the show that he thinks that so many of his path-breaking series, from the Civil War to Prohibition to even baseball, are really shows to educate people about the Constitution. And David Rubenstein and I just participated in a ceremony for new citizens. New citizens, as they study the Constitution, watch Ken and Lynn's shows. The Constitution Center is a place of education. It's designed to inspire you to spend your lives learning about the Constitution. There's no better place for us to celebrate Ken and Lynn, no better interviewer than David Rubenstein. Please join me in welcoming all of them. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. So, how long did it take to do this show?
We decided to do the film as we were finishing our history of World War II. So at the end of 2006, I looked at Lynn and said, you know, we have to do Vietnam. I think as you looked up the historical road from World War II, that Vietnam is the most important event after the Second World War, and we plowed ahead for the last 10 and a half years trying to tell it.
10 and a half years. So you worked for 10 and a half years. Where does the money come to do this show?
We've been in public broadcasting all of our professional lives, and we think it's the only place to be. And so we rely not on investors, but on underwriters, foundations, and individuals and corporations that are willing to do this. In this case, because we knew we had a fraught and controversial subject, something that was unfinished business, that we went across the political spectrum, inviting and asking for and enjoying support across that spectrum, in addition to a significant corporate sponsor, Bank of America, another group of individuals called the Better Angels Society. We have one, Maury Jane Perry is here, one of our Better Angels. probably the better angel, and just foundations and government granting agencies like the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. So a good deal of that time in the 10 years is not just production stuff, it's also reaching out to those partners, looking for them to take a risk, quite frankly, given how unfinished Vietnam is, how controversial it is.
So how long did you work on this? 10 and a half years, roughly?
Yes.
And how many people did you interview?
We interviewed 100 people. We actually met with probably 1,000 people to choose those 100 in America and in Vietnam, and 79 of them appear in the film. And it covers a pretty wide range of perspectives. People who fought in the war, people who fought against the war in the United States, people who covered it, Gold Star families, journalists, people who worked in the Pentagon, medics, doctors, nurses, a wide range of perspectives here and in Vietnam. We made the effort to talk to people on the winning side of the war, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, soldiers and civilians, and also people who fought on the losing side, the South Vietnamese, and many of them are here in the United States. They left the country after the war ended.
So what was the biggest surprise of your research? What was the thing that surprised you the most after 10 and a half years of research on this?
Well, I think we went into it with some sense. I'd lived through that period. I had a high draft number in the last year that it was, they were picking those birthdays. And I really thought I knew something, and almost immediately you realized how little you did know, that almost everything that we know, David, the conventional wisdom, whatever you want to call it, is so superficial and in many cases completely wrong, that we've spent 10 years sort of with a humility in relationships. They're just simple things. Ho Chi Minh's supremacy as the leader of North Vietnam, not quite true. What happened at the Gulf of Tonkin incident, not quite true. The way in which Nixon's campaign reached out to a foreign power at the time of a national election, the way in which we tend to separate kind of in a bipolar fashion, Nixon's domestic political paranoia with his expertise in foreign policy. We can show the way in which they're completely intertwined and interbraided, as are all of the other presidents going backwards, Johnson and Kennedy and Eisenhower and Truman, who are making huge, important strategic foreign policy decisions based on domestic political consideration, meaning, will I get reelected?
So over the period of time the United States was involved, when did the United States get involved in this war?
You could make the argument that it began in 1945 when the OSS parachuted into northern Vietnam, where this tiny revolutionary army called the Viet Minh was struggling to survive. It was led by Ho Chi Minh and General, we often say Giap, but pronounced Zap. We're trying to hold it together as a force against the Japanese occupation. We armed them. Ho Chi Minh said, I'm going to call this the Viet American Army. And a few months later, with an OSS officer standing next to him, he declared Vietnamese independence, quoting Thomas Jefferson, all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. And so what you see is a set of decisions and sort of Cold War mindset that takes apart a kind of natural inclination for Americans to be on the side of these people wishing liberation from their colonizers, just as we did.
So when did the war end?
Wow, that's a very good question. The fighting stopped in 1975 when the North Vietnamese took over and absorbed South Vietnam. But we'd like to say that there's a wonderful quote from a Vietnamese American writer, Viet Thanh Nguyen. He wrote something that we thought really appealed to what we were doing, which was that all wars are fought twice, on the battlefield and in our memory. And it's maybe fair to say that we are still in some ways fighting the Vietnam War and how we remember it, because we haven't figured out exactly what happened, which is why we wanted to make the film. There's a lot of misunderstanding, like Ken was saying, and there's a lot of arguing without a lot of understanding, and a lot of pain and rancor and just mistrust. And so in a way, you could say we're still kind of haunted by the ghosts of Vietnam, and in a way, in Vietnam, they're still fighting the Vietnam War in some senses.
So we often say now that we have been in Afghanistan for 16 years, the longest war in American history, but actually if we started in 1945 and we finished in 1975, that's 30 years.
Yes.
A long time.
I mean, we have advisors being shot at by the late 1950s. So we have parity with Afghanistan in that regard. But I think that you can really see all of these different options in Vietnam, and we like to say it lasted 30 years.
How many Americans were killed in the Vietnam War?
Over 58,000, several hundred thousand wounded, 250,000 South Vietnamese troops, over 1 million North Vietnamese soldiers and guerrillas, and we estimate at least 2 million civilians north and south, and tens of thousands more in the neighboring states of Laos and Cambodia.
And at the peak of the war, how many Americans were dying a week?
Well, the week, the apogee of that horrific statistic is in the spring of 1968, and it's, I think, more than 2,800 died that week. And of course, Life magazine is famous several weeks later for coming out and showing all the dead of that week.
So the war lasted about 30 years, you could say. We lost 58,000 men, hundreds of thousands wounded. What did it cost in terms of dollars?
Wow.
I think because of the passage of time, we did not feel comfortable as filmmakers trying to aggregate all of the new scholarship and all of the figures and numbers, saying there was a set figure, but because by the time you're talking about Truman dollars versus Ford dollars, you know, the translations are so loose, but it's trillions in today's money.
It's so interesting because I thought you meant what did it cost in a larger sense.
Well,
of
that's
what
a
did
more
it cost.
complicated
yes,
answer.
Yes, it is a much more complicated answer.
From the Vietnam War series is going to go on for
Over the next 2 weeks.
2 weeks,
It's
okay.
broadcast Sunday to Thursday, Sunday to Thursday.
Is it roughly the same length as your Civil War series?
It's significantly longer than that 12-hour series. It's a total of 10 episodes totaling 18 hours, but it's comparable to our series on baseball, comparable to our series on jazz, close to our series, a little bit longer than our series on World War II.
Okay, and let's talk about something related to the Constitution. Under the Constitution, the way it was drafted, Congress was given the right to declare war.
That's correct.
So in this case, this war, which 58,000 Americans lost their lives and hundreds of thousands were wounded, did Congress declare war?
Never once. They actually passed a resolution that, as one of the people in our film said, is like grandma's nightshirt. It covers everything, and extended to the president unprecedented discretionary executive power to wage a war. And of course, you could argue from the very, very beginning that this story of the Vietnam War engages constitutional questions in almost every article and almost every part of it, not the least of which is the war powers.
So we have a clip from the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which was the closest we came to a war resolution,
Exactly.
I guess you'd say.
So the summer of 1964, the U.S. has been promoting the South Vietnamese action against some North Vietnamese islands in complete violation of the Geneva Accords that had divided the two. And there was some American battleships or destroyers in the area, the Maddox and the Turner Joy. The small North Vietnamese Navy came out to attack. And what happens is, I think from a constitutional standpoint and from the arc of the Vietnam War, one of the most important events in all of American history.
So in other words, 64, something happened, and the United States Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution.
That's correct.
And that was the basis for going to war, more or less.
Exactly.
Okay.
We'd already had tens of thousands of advisors there. What we needed was what President Johnson, who had inherited the presidency from Kennedy, needed was a kind of set of his own guidelines that would permit him to eventually put what we call boots on the ground.
The situation in South Vietnam was so precarious. The government was teetering, and the revolution was gaining such strength that there was a great deal of worry that they would collapse. And so there was a lot of discussion inside the White House and the Pentagon that we're going to need to commit more. And so President Johnson asked for this resolution to be drafted, hoping that something would happen that would give him the opportunity to present it to Congress and get approval to wage the war as he wanted to. So the resolution was sitting in the drawer waiting for the Gulf of Tonkin to happen.
For those who may not be familiar with the history, you mentioned President Truman was involved, and then President Eisenhower inherited something. President Kennedy had some advisors go over. It is often said that had President Kennedy lived, he would have, after re-election perhaps, would have pulled all of our troops out. Do you see any evidence of that?
Well, you know what? I think one of the reasons why Vietnam's so rancorous is that it is filled, those arguments are filled not with facts but with arguments. People saying, well, if we'd only replace this general earlier, things would have been better. Well, that didn't happen. It's like saying if we pulled our pitcher in the 6th inning instead of the 7th, we wouldn't have lost. Those are just arguments. We're charged with what actually happened. But I think that Kennedy is one of those really important inflection points. Lyndon Johnson had a domestic agenda he wanted to accomplish. He wanted to be the second coming of FDR. He had very little expertise and knew it in foreign policy, and took on every single one of Kennedy's foreign policy apparatus. Dean Rusk at State, McNamara at Defense, McGeorge Bundy, Maxwell Taylor, everybody. And he said, I need you more than he needs you. And together, they led him into boots on the ground and a widened thing. So you could have said that Kennedy, had he lived, might have, with his own better expertise in foreign policy, understood the quagmire that was going in and may have arrested the momentum of his own people, but you just don't know. Once again, it's that conjecture, that argument.
And let's see the clip we have.
Yeah, so this is from the Gulf of Tonkin moment.
Johnson is sort of pre-positioned to move anyway. And it gives him really the instant that he needs to go to Congress and ask for a resolution that will allow him to deal with what he sees as aggression in Vietnam. And what he gets is a Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which is what he says, like Grandma's nightshirt, it covers everything. I think what Johnson is looking for is the opportunity, the right time, to send a message to North Vietnam that we're serious about supporting South Vietnam. If that message is sent, I think we misread the enemy because they're just as serious as we are.
On August 7th, 1964, by a vote of 88-2, the Senate passed what came to be called the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. In the House, not a single congressman opposed it. Senator Goldwater could no longer plausibly claim Johnson was failing to fight back against North Vietnam, while those voters concerned that the United States was in danger of becoming too deeply involved admired the president's measured response. Support for Johnson's handling of the war jumped overnight from 42% to 72%. The American public believed their president.
So Johnson is renominated or nominated for the Democratic Party nomination in 1964 with Hubert Humphreys as vice president. He wins that election and beats Barry Goldwater fairly decisively. From 64 to 68, he stays in the war. We send more troops over. More people are killed, Vietnamese and Americans. Towards 68, when he's looking at running for president again, how unpopular has the war become?
It is probably still supported by a majority of American citizens, but a majority of American citizens also think that maybe we shouldn't have gone there in the first place. And a majority don't like the way it's being handled. So you've got lots of different questions. Do we wish to be in Southeast Asia fighting the communists? That seems to still be prevailing, at least in early 68. But then 68, one of the most tumultuous years in American history, happens. First thing has happened is the Tet Offensive, in which the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong attack in scores and scores of places all up and down South Vietnam, province capitals, the big cities, lots of bases. And it's a huge defeat for them. They're beaten back in every single one of those places. Only in Hue does the battle go on for a long time. But it is so counter to what the American military and the president has been telling the American public about the progress in the war that you get a kind of public relations backlash. So it's devastating to the North and to the Viet Cong. It decimates their numbers, but you've got a concurrent public relations disaster for Johnson that really plows that in. He has a primary challenge in New Hampshire. He's expected to run away with it. He still wins handily, but it's not by the margin they want. He makes a decision to not run again, and Bobby Kennedy gets into the race, joining his other challenger, Eugene McCarthy. The assassination of Martin Luther King and the assassination of Bobby Kennedy in that first 6 months happen and then we, end up at a fractured country, and specifically that summer, a fractured Democratic Party. The Republicans are joyfully, nearly unanimously bringing in Richard Nixon, the former vice president, as their standard bearer, but the Democrats, decimated by assassination, torn over the war, have nominated Humphrey, traditionally the hero to the party's liberal wing, but the challenge by McCarthy, the lack of Bobby Kennedy, other challenges, George McGovern, are setting the stage for a Democratic convention taking place in August of 1968 in Chicago for one of these seminal events, too, in American history.
So Humphrey is the Democratic Party nominee, going to run against Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, what is his view on the Vietnam War?
Well, he feels it's just being bungled and mishandled, and so he's had a reputation from the very beginning as a strong anti-communist, and he doesn't publicly say much more than that. But he has joined with his soon-to-be national security advisor, a Harvard professor named Henry Kissinger, adopted what you could call a realpolitik thing, that this is an unwinnable war, we have to get out as fast as we can, but of course, because domestic political considerations matter, we have to get out without seeming to have lost. No president, Truman, Eisenhower, but particularly Kennedy and Johnson, and now Nixon, do not want to be the president that lost the first American war.
So many Americans who are against the war feel that Humphrey is going to continue the policies of Johnson.
That's
so
correct.
There's a protest of Humphrey becoming the Democratic Party nominee in 1968 at the Democratic Convention. And so you have a clip about what's going on and what occurs at the Democratic Convention.
Yeah, it's sort of
right?
leading. It's a prologue to setting the stage, and I think it's so interesting because we go to one of the most important aspects of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the first one, which is about free speech and assembly, and this idea that we've inherited from our own founding that when you find things not to your liking, you have the ability to express those things.
Right?
Good evening from Chicago, where the 35th National Democratic Convention opens tomorrow with the promise of turmoil inside this hall and a threat of violence without.
Both sides moved in their troops on a balmy Sunday morning for the confrontation of Chicago. Some 6,000 crack Army troops, riot-trained and ready for action. The Army soldiers moved out to secret locations around the city after one of the largest troop movements in domestic history.
Some 15,000 protesters had gathered in Chicago, most to register their anguish over the war. Some bent on disrupting the convention. Richard J. Daley, the Democratic mayor of Chicago, was determined that there be no trouble in his city. 12,000 Chicago policemen were on alert. In addition to the 6,000 U.S. Army troops, there were 6,000 more armed National Guardsmen and 1,000 intelligence agents from the FBI, the CIA, and the military. Mayor Daley cordoned off the Chicago amphitheater where the convention was being held and denied the protesters permits to march or to sleep in the city's parks.
Are you planning to go without the permit if you don't get the permit?
Given the fact that for many months we have notified this city and this nation that we wish to hold a demonstration and an assembly in Chicago to register our convictions about the war, the tens of thousands of people coming to the city of Chicago constitute a permit. Our fight is with the militarism that is developing in this country and the response to legitimate political and social grievances by bringing in troops rather than dealing with the real issues and real problems.
In the name of security, freedom of the press, freedom of movement, perhaps as far as the demonstrators themselves are concerned, even freedom of speech, have been severely restricted here. A Democratic convention is about to begin in a police state. There just doesn't seem to be any other way to say it.
So for those who are young in the audience here, who was that man on television?
Yeah, that's Walter Cronkite.
Yeah.
He was the most trusted man in America back then. There were 3 television networks, and he was the news anchor of the CBS Evening News. He had been a reporter in World War II, and basically everything he said, he was above everybody else in the news business. And he represented sort of a middle-of-the-road, totally impartial, just honest and important voice. There was a critical moment, I think, in his reputation when the news business began soon after he was the anchor and on the exact timing after the Kennedy assassination, and he was describing it in real time, and he became very upset in explaining to the country that the president had been killed, and took a moment to sort of gather himself. I think America fell in love with Walter Cronkite at that moment, and this is 5 years later, and he's the voice of reason, and everybody trusted him.
And he's already said earlier in the year, this is August, but in February of '68, he comes back from witnessing the Tet Offensive, and specifically the battle for Hue, the one place where that battle went on, and says that Vietnam is not worth it, that we should negotiate our way out of it as honorable people. This is what we should do, that it's a stalemate. So he's...
So what did Lyndon Johnson care what Walter Cronkite thought?
Well, there's an apocryphal thing that he said, well, if I've lost, Walter Cronkite, I've lost the country, and that's why he decided. That never happened. There are many other factors that could not have helped, but there are many other factors that the president used to determine why he would not seek re-election in his own right. And it's part of the dramatic story of '68. And then by the time you get to this moment in August, what you really have is a battle there. I mean, if you're drawing lines, you'd have 15,000 protesters, and you have 25,000 Army troops in the United States, National Guardsmen, activated police, and intelligence officers against each other, and you can do the battle lines the way you might do at Tet or Yadrang Valley.
One of the things that's so poignant in seeing that footage and knowing what's going to happen, which is violent clashes on the streets of Chicago, is that the policemen and the soldiers are young kids too, and there's a lot of resentment between the working class kids who are working in the armed services and the police versus the college kids who seem privileged and aren't subject to the draft. So we had military service, a draft, but it wasn't fairly applied. So people who were more privileged didn't have to go. And there was enormous amount of resentment about that.
So the '68 election is very close, but in the end, Nixon wins.
Yes.
Does Nixon do anything in the election that helps him win relating to Vietnam?
Yes, it does. Yes, he does. So he had a commanding lead early on based on the disorder at the Democratic Convention. In fact, he started his campaign in the traditional Democratic stronghold of Chicago, and millions turned out to sort of cheer him on. But within a couple of weeks of the election itself, Johnson announced that there had been some real progress at the talks between us and the North Vietnamese, and Humphrey's poll numbers skyrocketed and was really coming up hard on Nixon's heels. And what happened next was for a while contested history, but it is no longer. Nixon and his campaign reached out to the South Vietnamese, our allies, and said, boycott the talks. You'll get better terms from Nixon than you would from Humphrey, even though this is coming from a man who knows he has to end the war right away, meaning essentially betray South Vietnam. Chiu, the head of South Vietnam, agrees that he'll boycott the race. Johnson learns of this through secret wiretaps and calls Everett Dirksen, the Republican leader in the Senate, his friend, and says, Ev, this is treason. We have that tape. And Dirksen said, yes, it is. And Nixon calls in and said, oh, Mr. President, I'd never do anything. It's all foreign policy, everything. We check our things at the shore. And Johnson says, fine, okay, Dick. And Nixon was lying, and Johnson knew he was lying. What remains a conjecture is why Johnson didn't say anything about it, or Humphrey didn't say anything about it, and lots of opinions. But as it turned out, Nixon won by only 0.7 of a percentage point, 34.4% to 32.7%. 43, sorry.
Was it legal for Nixon's campaign to do what they did, and was it legal for Johnson to wiretap Nixon?
Well, I think that one of the arguments is no to the first thing, and the other one probably know as well, although under the guise of national security and intelligence gathering, this stuff is going on all the time. And perhaps one of the reasons why Johnson didn't admit is that he didn't want to show that they had the methods and show that they've been bugging their ally, and learned of this entreaty from Nixon and the Republican Party.
So Nixon becomes president, and he begins a process of trying to pull out of Vietnam, and takes a long time. But during that process, something called the Pentagon Papers are released. What are the Pentagon Papers?
Yeah, so Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense under Johnson, and he actually ultimately tried to convince Johnson to de-escalate the war, and Johnson more or less fired him. Right before he was fired, he commissioned this study because he was racked with doubt about what had happened, how America had gone so far astray in Vietnam. So he ordered his assistants to do a study of how America got involved in Vietnam, going back to President Truman. And it was a group of people worked for a number of years, 3 or 4 years, collecting all the primary source documents, the memos, the telegrams, the letters, all the sort of raw material that had helped the White House and the Pentagon make decisions. And they collated it all and wrote analysis of the entire history of the Vietnam War from 1945 to 1967. That was the project. And in 1971, this enormous document, 3,000 pages, got leaked to the press.
It was leaked by who?
Daniel Ellsberg and
Daniel Ellsberg was who?
Anthony Russo.
And Anthony Russo.
They're
were
both
they?
employees of the RAND Corporation, which was a defense subcontractor that had been asked to sort of comment on this vast volume of
So
material.
they leaked this to initially the New York Times and later the Washington Post.
Right.
Well, what's the big deal, and why did Nixon care? Because this is about all the things before Nixon that had been done wrong. Why would he care that somebody is criticizing his predecessors?
Well, right. So at first he thought, oh, this is great. It's showing all the mistakes everybody else made. No problem. And we have him on tape saying it's about Johnson, it's not about us. But his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, said, well, wait a minute. Who knows what other documents are going to get leaked? And if we don't crack down on this, we got to make sure that these classified documents cannot be published, because who knows if other things are going to be leaked that are going to be about what we did in '68 to affect the election, or other things that we've been doing. And the secret bombing of Cambodia was something that they had done that was also illegal. And so they were very careful, and they started immediately bringing legal proceedings to stop the newspapers from publishing.
And what did the Supreme Court decide?
They decided in favor of a free press, and it's very interesting that the story that goes beyond the final clip that we'll do, will be the fact that Nixon's concern over the existence of the tapes that will show his collusion in the '68 election, plus this sort of burgeoning leaking that's going on, that's besetting, of course, every president to the present. He's going to start a completely illegal clandestine operative unit within the White House called the Plumbers, which are going to go out. They first are attempting to rob Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist of his files to discredit. You can hear Nixon saying, try him in the press, try him in the press.
Gotta get him.
And that doesn't happen. They're going to try to bomb the Brookings Institution to get the documents that they think show their culpability back in '68, and then ultimately, a year later, literally a year later, they're going to burglarize the offices of the Democratic National Committee in the Watergate, and that's going to end his presidency.
We have a clip on the Pentagon Papers. Why don't we take a look at that?
On June 12, 1971, Richard Nixon's daughter, Tricia, married Edward Cox in the White House Rose Garden. The country watched it all on television. The wedding was still news the next day, but another story on the front page of the New York Times caught the president's attention. The article by Neil Sheehan was the first report of what came to be called the Pentagon Papers, 7,000 pages of highly classified documents and historical narrative, compiled secretly at the orders of former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. He had hoped a study of the decision-making process that had led the United States to become so deeply involved in Vietnam would help future policymakers avoid similar errors.
I thought I knew a great deal. I thought I knew most of what was worth knowing about the war. And suddenly, I didn't. It wasn't a reporter's version of an event. It was their version of an event. It was their telegrams, their orders, their memoranda, etc.
That piece in the Times is, of course, a massive security leak from the Pentagon, you know. Yeah. It all relates, of course, to everything up until we came in. Yeah. And it's hard on Johnson, it's hard on Kennedy, it's hard on Lodge.
At first, Nixon was not unduly disturbed by the newspaper's revelations. They reflected badly on his Democratic predecessors, not on him. But Henry Kissinger quickly convinced Nixon that if the Times were permitted to reveal the classified secrets of earlier presidents, it was only a matter of time until someone leaked his own. The Justice Department obtained a temporary court order forbidding the Times from publishing further installments on the grounds of national security. But soon, both the Boston Globe and the Washington Post were also printing excerpts. On June 30th, 1971, the United States Supreme Court, citing the First Amendment, ruled 6-3 that the Times had the right to publish the stolen documents.
And I went down into the basement to wait for the presses to start to roll, and they had these huge round reams of paper. And finally the presses started to roll. And it was just an exquisite moment of vindication of the freedom of the press in this country and how important it is.
So we have some time now for some student questions, and why don't we hear the first one?
Okay, the question, is coming from up here, and we have student named Tucker, so I'm going to hand it over to Tucker.
Hi, I'm Tucker. I would like to know how you think the opinion of Vietnam will change after your documentary.
Wow. How the opinion in the country?
The first student question is how you think the opinion about the Vietnam War will change after this documentary is seen by everybody.
You know, I want to make sure that everyone understands that Lynn and I had no political agenda or no axe to grind, that we wanted to be umpires calling balls and strikes. But we felt that the knowledge of Vietnam, as I said to David earlier, was so superficial and in many cases absolutely wrong, if not backwards, that just being able to say, I didn't know that. So we had the first episode on last night. We've been deluged with people who said they thought they were there, who said they were there and they thought they knew something, and they knew nothing about it. So what we'd like to do is just provide you with the aggregation of the most recent scholarship, the most recent testimonies of people, as Lynn described, from all sides, the presidential tapes, the narrative of the policy decisions, what's going on militarily where these battles do matter, the political scene back at home, and then give a public information that then permits them to make the kinds of decisions they want. Obviously, Vietnam is watershed. Obviously, a good deal of the divisions we experience today began in Vietnam, and we're still feeling the echoes of that. But we wouldn't want to say these are the 6 lessons. We'd want to learn lessons, but we'd think that everybody can draw their own conclusions from it. I just think from the 3 things, you see how contemporary they are. You know, giving the president power to wage war, as we're doing in Afghanistan and Iraq, without a congressional declaration of war. You've got questions of free speech, particularly with an internet, and who gets it, and who can say it, and what's controlled access to it. And then, of course, the ultimate decisions about stolen documents. I mean, this is now. So we think that Vietnam is an extraordinary event that is, to this day, echoing in our present moment.
All right, second question from a student.
Hi, my name's Maggie, and since you took so much time to make these episodes, I just wanted to know which one is the most significant to you and why.
So for those who didn't hear, the question is, what is the most significant of the episodes to you?
You know, we don't have a favorite or most significant episode because what we're really doing is telling one big, huge story. So we had to put together every scene, every moment, every chapter, every episode, and have it all fit together into one big, huge, complicated story. And that was the great challenge of making this film because, like Ken was saying, Even though we thought we knew a lot about it, it turned out to be so much more complicated. And one of the things that we started from the beginning was that we didn't want to make the mistake that we think Americans usually make when we think about the Vietnam War, which is to think about what happened to America and Americans. So to try to understand what it was like for Vietnamese people in Vietnam and Vietnamese people who have come to the United States was really, really challenging for us to just get to know people and understand what they had to say, and then to filter their story into the big American story we were telling. So it was like we had this big, huge puzzle, and we had a lot of pieces missing. And we just had to fill them in, and we had to get them in the right order. And it was not a game at all, but it was a complicated puzzle, and fitting it all together into something that made sense to us at the end, as much as something as tragic and sometimes incomprehensible as this really terrible war. That was what we spent the last 10 years doing.
So you like all the episodes. It's like asking a parent, which child do you like the most?
Exactly. And I also think if you think of it as a Russian novel, with lots of different chapters and dozens of characters, as we have here, not just the 79 on camera, but dozens of others who are historical figures, at what point do you like the book? Is it the beginning that draws you in? Is it the middle when there are all these different things? Is it the end when people who have been at war suddenly remember that it isn't so good and reconciliation is pretty nice?
So we have time for one more student question. And where is that?
My name's Malia.
Right behind you.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yep, we see you.
Okay, yes.
I wanted to ask, how long did it take for you to do this documentary? And wait, what was next? And where did you start off at?
Okay, for those who didn't hear, how long did it take you to do this documentary, and when did you actually start?
Well, as we said before, we made the decision in 2006. A lot of the next few years was trying to raise money and trying to think ourselves about what we knew and what we didn't know and how to construct it. Where the film starts off has always been the most difficult part for us. It'll be interesting if you have a chance to see it, to think about the decisions we made. We kind of put you right in the middle of the eerie, terrifying, unexplained moment of battle, of combat that only people who've been in combat know. And then we go to a Marine veteran who admits that he and his wife had been friends with another couple for 12 years before the wives were talking, and they both found out that both men had been Marines in Vietnam. He said nobody said a word. It was like living in a family with an alcoholic father. Shh, we don't talk about that. And then he said, but now people are beginning to ask, what happened, what happened? So we used his question, repeated twice for emphasis, to sort of animate what the next 17 hours and 55 minutes would be of our film. What just happened? And we found that a good way to begin, and then we go back to the beginning. Storytelling is usually just and then, and put together, as Lynn was saying, this super, super complicated narrative that would take us 10 years to do.
So we're pretty much out of time. I have a final question, which is, Ken, you're very famous for your haircut.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think if you had a different haircut, you would not have been so successful?
Well, I'm now beginning, I'm now at a point where I can't really answer, David, that question, but I know that I don't want to risk cutting the hair in a kind of Samson and Delilah-like anxiety that perhaps if by cutting it, it would change in somehow the chops that we've developed over the last few years. But I work with Lynn, who changes her hairdo fairly often, and her talent is undiminished. So even if I were to sort of shrink into sort of pedestrian nothingness, she'd be around to sort of keep things going.
All right. Well, thank you for the answer to that question, and thank you for the hard work you've done in putting this together and educating Americans about this war.
Thank you, David. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Happy Constitution Day.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.